Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. This video is the next in a series looking at the financial implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the global economy. And in today's video, I want to talk specifically about the challenges that Russia now faces with regards to technology and a variety of related sectors. So in this video, I'll run through the concept of reverse industrialization. I'll then go on to talk about two specific sectors that are going to be heavily impacted: aviation and medical equipment. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think will happen to the Russian economy going forward and what the implications of that are for the global economy. So before we get into all of that, if I could ask you to give me a thumbs up at some point during this video if you're enjoying the content, and also please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And don't forget, I always include chapters, so if there's a section you're not that interested in, it's really easy to skip over it. And if you'd like to support the channel, please have a look in the description below where you'll find links to both Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon, and also the YouTube Super Thanks feature. Russia is facing years of reverse industrialization. Now, I've touched on this in other videos, but the problem that Russia and also other countries around the world would have in their situation is that the global economy is dependent upon technology being at the cutting edge. And Silicon Valley is generally accepted as the place around the world where most of the technological advances take place. There are other places, obviously, but that's really the hub. That's where everybody focuses their technological knowledge. And it makes absolute sense that everybody wants to benefit from the latest technology. So Russia, along with the rest of the world, is utilising all sorts of tech that's been designed by other countries. And the problem that they're facing right now is that the sanctions are targeting that tech and preventing them from being able to access any of it going forward. And without access to that technology or the ability to be able to replace it, then that means that everything will start to slow down and potentially go backwards in Russia. And that's what this concept of reverse industrialization is referring to. It means that whilst the rest of the world is carrying on with its development and moving forward, Russia potentially could start going in the opposite direction. Russia is highly reliant on imports of high-tech goods and imports around $19 billion worth annually. 45% of those imports come directly from the EU, 21% from the US, only 11% from China, and 2% from the UK. The largest import categories are aerospace goods, which account for around $6 billion worth of imports, and IT and communication goods, which accounts for about $4 billion. This table shows a breakdown of the different categories of goods that were imported, and you can see there are a variety of different sectors that are impacted here, including aerospace, electronics, IT, manufacturing, life sciences, biotech, and nuclear technology. These two pie charts show that breakdown in a different format, and you can see the spread of different sectors that will be impacted by the removal of these technology imports. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the exposure that the aerospace business has to the USA, predominantly because Airbus and Boeing are the major exporters of all of the parts and equipment for aircraft. Semiconductor chips are the brains behind the technology in so many different products these days. Everybody's familiar with the fact that cars have a lot of electronics which are driven by these chips, but virtually every single electrical appliance these days has some form of chip within it. So the world has become highly dependent on these microchips. And this dependence was exposed recently when we had a shortage of chips during the pandemic period, and we saw the production lines of vehicle manufacturers and other businesses grind to a halt because they simply couldn't get hold of the chips that they needed. Now, the chip sector is dominated by a number of large businesses, and the more sophisticated a chip is, the higher the level of technology and the higher the likelihood that that chip is owned by a company in the US or it's licensed out to other chip manufacturers. And the sanctions that have been introduced by Russia are designed to ensure that they cannot access that higher level technology. Russia relies on chip imports for a lot of its industry and has been attempting to develop its own semiconductor businesses, but with limited success. Domestic manufacturing capacities in Russia remain very limited, and it does not produce any high-end semiconductors. The US has imposed curbs on the import of such chips through the restriction of trade technologies made with US origin software. These type of restrictions have an extraterritorial reach. If a semiconductor is produced in Taiwan using US software, as most semiconductors are, the Taiwanese firm will need an export license from the US to be able to sell to Russia. Other countries have followed suit in sanctioning Russia via export restrictions and have also targeted semiconductor technologies because of their strategic importance. Depriving Russia of access to its chip supply in this way will severely affect the outlook of almost all industrial sectors. So this is why the Bank of Russia's research department is predicting reverse industrialization, because it knows that this technology is going to be switched off for Russia and it just doesn't have the capability to be able to generate it itself. Now, you may be watching this thinking, that's fine, they'll just source all of the chips from China. Well, they won't be able to do that for two reasons. Firstly, China will be under the same restrictions. They will need to have licenses to be able to produce this level of technology. And secondly, China knows that the US is watching this, and China doesn't want to come under sanctions in the same way as Russia has. So there will be an effective cutoff of this technology, and that means that Russia is going to face a period where it just doesn't have the technology that it used to have access to. One of the sectors that will be most heavily impacted by the sanctions, Russia will no longer be able to access any parts or machinery for its existing fleet of aircraft. Finding alternatives to Western aviation technology will be an impossible task in the near and medium term. Airbus and Boeing enjoy a duopoly for larger airplanes, and key components like their engines are produced by Western companies. The market for regional airliners is more contested, and Russia and China are trying to enter this market segment. But Chinese and Russian-built regional jet airliners are heavily reliant on Western components. For the Russian-built Sukhoi Superjet 100, Western parts are estimated to account for more than half of the unit costs. While there are plans to replace them and double the Russian share of value added to 30%, this will be too little, too late to save Sukhoi Superjet 100. Interestingly, China has also refused to provide parts. Older Soviet and Russian aircraft could fly for longer, but it's hard to see how the Russian aviation industry could sustain its international and domestic business. The combination of an embargo of aviation technology and the exclusion from lucrative markets will clip the wings of Russian aviation. A final point I wanted to touch on is medical supplies. The EU is the main provider of medical goods to Russia. This chart shows the import breakdown of biotechnology and life sciences goods for Russia. And as you can see, the EU accounts for around 60% of all imports. However, for pharmaceuticals in particular, it accounts for around 90%, which is in line with current global patterns of specialization. Now, sanctions have not directly targeted medical goods for humanitarian reasons, but financial sanctions and the collapse of Russian purchasing power will make it difficult to import medical goods. Even locally produced pharmaceuticals rely on foreign imports and technologies that have become difficult to obtain. And there have been reports that stocks of some pharmaceuticals such as insulin are running short in Russia. Now, all countries in the world are obliged by the Geneva Convention to ensure access to medical treatment is not inhibited. Medical goods are therefore not included in the sanctions, but NATO-aligned countries must also consider steps to ensure that untargeted measures like financial sanctions do not impede Russia's access to medical goods. So I think that's a really interesting point, that the Geneva Convention means that all of the countries of the West need to keep supplying medical equipment and pharmaceuticals to Russia. However, the practicalities of being able to do that under the current sanctions are making it difficult, and there is a real risk that Russia could run out of certain medicines and pharmaceuticals. So what's the summary and conclusion today? The sanctions are definitely going to have a massive impact on the Russian economy. A lot of businesses in Russia built up significant amounts of stock prior to the invasion, which is an interesting development, and I don't know whether or not they were instructed to do that by Moscow or whether they just had a feeling that something was going to happen. But there was certainly some planning done by a lot of companies, which has been beneficial to them in the short term. Those supplies will run out at some point. And at that point, we will then start seeing the impact of these sanctions. And that's likely to lead to falling productivity, falling numbers of jobs, falling income, and falling GDP in Russia. So that sounds like a normal recession. However, the sting in the tail here is the lack of technology. And the fact that the Bank of Russia have stated that Russia could potentially now enter reverse industrialization is one of the biggest negatives that I've heard coming out of the war. Nobody wants to go backwards in terms of technology. We all want to keep moving forward. We all want the latest developments, and we want things done quicker and faster and in a more efficient way. And you want to buy things that move with the times. You don't want to be going backwards in terms of technology. That is a really regressive step for any society to take. And I think it's quite grim. It just means that that economy is going to be frozen in time. It's almost like a return to what we had in the 70s and 80s in communism, where the Western world was developing lots of modern and exciting equipment, and the Soviet Union just wasn't moving at that same pace. The world is now completely interlinked, and we're all dependent on some genius somewhere coming up with some new way of doing something and then selling that idea to other companies to be able to use it in their goods and services. And what we're seeing here is Russia is being forced out of that global society. So they'll no longer be able to share in the benefit of what's being done, all of the latest developments. They'll have to develop their own technology. And when you've got only 144 million people, it's very difficult to be able to have all of the specialism and expertise in your country. And what Russia is also likely to see is a brain drain. It's likely that anybody who is a genius, who does want to work at the forefront of technology, is likely to leave Russia to go to Silicon Valley or somewhere else around the world, work in that specialism, and then maybe go back to Russia at some point in the future. But in the near term, in the short term, over the next couple of years, Russia is going to go backwards in terms of technology, and that's going to have a big impact on all of its industry, because industry is highly dependent on semiconductors and microchips and technology. So if you don't have all of that new technology, it means that your industry is going backwards and therefore won't be able to compete with the rest of the world. In terms of what the impact on the global economy will be, well, Russia's main form of exports are raw materials. It's gas and oil and a lot of other commodities. So none of that requires any real form of technology. So from that perspective, I don't think we'll see a major negative impact directly on the global economy. Obviously, the higher prices for all of those commodities that we've seen during the war is pushing up inflation, which is putting more pressure on all of the economies around the world. And it's very likely that we could see a global recession kick in as a direct result of that. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, you found it useful, informative and educational. If you did, then please give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already.